Hello, everyone. My name is Marissa Grennan, and this is my colleague, Annalise Zimmer. We are both Master of Environmental Management candidates at the Yale School of the Environment, and we would like to thank our classmates, Ryan Clemens, Malika Talwar, and Christina Rodriguez, for their invaluable help in shaping this panel. We are thrilled to welcome you to Panel 1B, Marine and Coastal Impacts and Solutions. This panel explores the impacts of and management solutions to climate change in ecosystems ranging from the Alaskan Arctic to Antarctica's Southern Ocean, and stretching from the Long Island Sound of Connecticut to the Andaman Islands of India.
We're very lucky to have an alumna of the Yale School of the Environment, Courtney Durham, moderating this panel. Courtney is a senior associate working with the Pew Charitable Trust's Protecting Coastal Wetlands and Coral Reefs project, where she supports the protection and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems internationally. Previously, Courtney worked at the World Resources Institute, where she supported the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiating team and assisted countries' efforts to develop their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Courtney received her master's in environmental management from the Yale School of the Environment in 2019 and was an author of the Yale University Press book, A Better Planet: 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. Thank you, Courtney, for being here today. We'll pass the mic to you now.
Thank you very much, Annalise. I am, in fact, Courtney Durham, and I am very happy to moderate this discussion today. I'm a 2019 graduate of this wonderful school. And as Annalise mentioned, I'm now working for the Pew Charitable Trust, supporting governments in protecting and restoring their coastal wetlands and coral reefs as part of their commitments under the Paris Agreement. Now, I know that you are here for the title of this session, but you're going to stick around for the content. We're going to have a look at coastal and marine impacts and solutions to climate change. The organizers have done a wonderful job pulling together this conference on a topic of ever important prevalence, right? We've got the ocean climate nexus. We've got a great lineup of panelists here with us today. So here's how the session is going to work. We're going to armchair travel from north to south, pole to pole, to understand how climate change is impacting different regions of the world. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists for a short presentation that will play on the screen, and then we're going to reconvene for a Q&A after. Now, what would be really useful is if you could send along any questions that pop up in your mind during the presentations so that we can have an interactive and lively Q&A. So without further ado, our conversations today starts with Austin Amasuk. He is a Kinikmui Inupiaq, born and raised in Nome, Alaska. He works as a marine advocate for Kawarik Inc., a tribal consortium for the Bering Strait region. Today, he's going to share insights and his experience in ways in which climate change is impacting tribal communities and the ecosystems on which they depend. Austin, over to you.
Will climate change be the great equalizer? Will it impact rich and poor, rural and urban alike? My Arctic homeland is thawing. I've had to rebury the bones of my ancestors because of coastal erosion destroying graves. Our waters and marine life are subject to harmful algal blooms, which may be contributing to causes of large-scale region-wide deaths in our region, of marine mammals and seabird life. Sea ice has caused an increase in shipping, which has resulted in buoyed whale entanglements. And evidence of ship strikes upon large whales is evident in 10% of those Arctic populations. Most recently, it appears shipping has resulted in a region-wide foreign marine debris event of plastics and petrochemicals that started in July and is still occurring as we speak. What has been the answer from our leaders to address these problems? Unfortunately, our leaders seek to militarize the Arctic instead of working with local people who deal with oil spills, signs of ecosystem collapse, and an uncertain future for our communities. We desire a sustainable life from the ocean and land we have always used. Each day and each month of the year, there are wild foods that we hunt and gather, but that is changing. My home region is poor. Our region is rural. the impacts to food security we experience are largely ignored. As climate change occurs, the animals we have used for millennia, such as seals and walrus and seabirds and fish, are mired in what appear to be the beginning stages of ecological collapse. And how we access the ocean is changing. Hunters such as myself have been keen observers and have contributed a great deal to our understanding of the ocean and its life. And we are considering the possibility that there will be localized extinctions of ice-associated marine mammals as we experience these dramatic changes. As a result of COVID, we saw how that disaster, which is still occurring, exposes the weaknesses in social nets. When people in urban areas experienced shortages in grocery stores, action was taken with a stimulus package. But the land and water is our grocery store. With climate change, we must consider what it means to be poor and rural, and also what it means not to be part of the dominant race. Since at least 1950, our elders have recognized that global warming was taking place. And based upon their legends and stories, I could see and reflect on it happening before my eyes as willows, shrubs, and trees colonized my once mostly treeless landscape. But at that time, we were not at the knee of the curve of climate change. But now we are considering how far we are past the tipping point. The fourth National Climate Impact Assessment acknowledges the great threat posed by climate change. And Alaska Native people agree with and have urged our leaders to acknowledge those threats with sound climate policy. But it seems our political leaders mash the accelerator to more destruction. Troubling as well, it appears the US is drawing from key international peacekeeping treaties. And we must not forget that we in the Arctic want peace, and our cultural identity is in jeopardy if peace and international collaboration is not part of the package of climate change policies. If we can ratchet down the high level of military spending, there may be ways we can seek to become a humanitarian superpower instead of seeking to use our military power to influence the balance of that power. The fourth National Climate Impact Assessment was released just 2 years ago and proposed that there may be changes to fisheries distribution and timing and severe weather changes. Those and other changes have already materialized in Alaska and pose threats to our way of life. Since at least 2000, we have urged state and federal agencies to help us mitigate impacts to our ocean and our lands as a result of climate change. The impacts from increased shipping have resulted in many things that have changed our way of life. The hundreds of little things that must be done aren't being done. I'm just one tribal advocate who has been pleading for sound climate policy and urge you all to try and put yourself in our shoes as we deal with the severity of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Austin. Next up, we've got Dr. Shimi Anisfeld. He's a senior lecturer and research scientist at the Yale School of the Environment, one of my favorite professors at the school. Shimi's going to be speaking about how sea level rise impacts salt marsh ecosystems, focused mostly on the northeastern region of the United States. Shimi, over to you.
Hello, my name is Shimi Anisfeld. I'm on the faculty at YSE, and I'm going to give you the view from Long Island Sound, and in particular, how sea level rise affects Long Island Sound's salt marshes. This is Long Island Sound. It's been called the urban sea, dominated by New York City and the urban areas of Long Island, as well as coastal Connecticut, including New Haven here with the Yale School of the Environment. So there are a lot of long-standing anthropogenic impacts to salt marshes in in Long Island Sound. And yet there are some relatively unimpacted systems, including the 3 sites here, which I'm going to highlight in my talk. If you're at the coast, maybe the most obvious impact of climate change is sea level rise. In New London, Connecticut, on Long Island Sound, sea level has been rising at about 2.7 millimeters per year. For context, we know sea level has been was pretty stable for several thousand years until it started to rise at the end of the 19th century due to anthropogenic climate change, and continues to rise and even accelerate to where we are now. If you're really thinking about the impact at the coast, though, it really looks a little bit more like this. It's not like 2.7 millimeters every year, year after year. There's a lot of variability to it, especially if you're looking at the highest water levels by month. You can still see the clear climate change, sea level rise signal here, but you also see the impacts of individual hurricanes, nor'easters, storm surge events that can really raise water levels temporarily for a short time period. If you're interested in how marshes respond to this, some of you are very familiar with salt marshes, others maybe not. The key thing is that salt marsh grasses, which dominate these systems, are considered ecosystem engineers. They have this eco-geomorphic feedback loop, which allows them to respond dynamically to sea level rise by accreting sediment. So they rise in elevation as sea level rises. But that feedback only works within certain limits. Research that a doctoral student, Troy Hill, did showed that the accretion rates in salt marshes in this area have accelerated. So at the beginning of the 20th century, marshes were accreting at 1 millimeter a year, and now they're more like 3 millimeters a year. So they're accreting more rapidly, but not fast enough to keep up with sea level rise. So there's been this net loss of marsh surface elevation relative to sea level. Marshes are getting wetter. And that gets reflected at some sites in this submergence phenomenon, where marshes get too wet, they lose the vegetation, they become this intertidal mudflat. And then the question is, as sea level rise continues to accelerate, are more and more sites going to look like this? Are we going to lose a lot of marshes at the seaward edge? Thinking about what we could do about it, maybe the most important thing is to mitigate climate change. We have some sea level rise baked in from our greenhouse gas emissions to date, but there's really, some very different futures in terms of the rates of sea level rise, depending on what we do. At the local scale, there are other issues that affect marsh's ability to keep up with sea level rise, like sediment supply. And there also are other stressors like pollution, herbivory that we could deal with locally. But a lot of people think kind of long-term, the future of marshes is in upslope migration. You lose the marsh at the seaward edge, but they migrate upslope. If you kind of think about how this might work, this is a simple model. You've got the upper edge of the marsh with typical marsh plants like this one, Iva frutescens, sometimes called high tide bush. As the water level rises, the plants will kind of march upslope, and gradually the soil also will become marsh-like. The problem is, though, that there are barriers to this. It's not like empty space for the plants to move into. So we've been thinking about what is the marsh moving into, and we've discovered, to our surprise, that a lot of places in Connecticut, marshes are moving into mowed lawns, and they continue to be mowed even as the marsh moves in. So this may not be obvious, but this is actually a mowed marsh. And if you look closely at it, you can see there's Juncus gerardii there. That's a marsh plant. That's actually what's being mowed. So we've worked with park staff to create these no-mow zones, which can help marshes move upslope. You can kind of see this whole area used to be mowed, and now it's mostly not mowed. They still have strips that they're mowing, so we can do the experiment and the measurements and compare. And these marginal areas, this is an area which is flooded on high tide. Not every high tide, but this is not a storm surge. This is just a higher than average high tide. And you can see, the lawn is clearly being flooded. Next to it is this no-mow zone where the marsh plants have really come in. In this case, it's shrubs, both the high tide bush I mentioned earlier and Baccharis helimifolia. And also, by the way, this is Hammonasset State Park. A lot of campsites here, many of which are also, the edges of which are on marsh. So that's also flooded. In some sites, instead of having a lawn as a barrier, we have trees. So the marshes are backing into a woodland. And there it's probably a more serious barrier in the sense that it takes longer for trees to get replaced by marsh grasses than in the case of a lawn. But it's happening, and you can kind of see it's happening here. You can see the marsh plants moving up slope. You can see these trees are stressed out. They lost their leaves early this year. This is at Barn Island. And in fact, I had a student, Mary Scholl, who did a great work at Hammonasset State Park in a cedar stand where the cedars were being killed essentially by sea level rise, and trying to understand that process and how the marsh plants move in underneath it. I'll just show you one of her figures, which is she did some dendrochronology work with help from Craig Broderson to understand when did these trees die, and found that they started to die actually in 2009, but they really, most of the trees that she measured died after Irene and Sandy in 2011 and 2012. So it's some combination of long-term sea level rise and these leading to cedar death, which in our case, we think of as a good thing. It allows the marsh plants to come in underneath and creates or sustains this vital habitat. There are some barriers, though, that are harder to overcome, people and geology. Both of those are shown in this slide from Brantford. And here you have a parking lot, which is a prime marsh migration zone, but obviously marsh migration is not happening because people have claimed this as hard infrastructure. You also see here this subdivision, which you might think of as, you know, an anthropogenic barrier, but it's also actually a geologic barrier. It turns out in our post-glacial landscape, we have a lot of steep topography, and this is several meters above the marsh. So the marsh doesn't really have an opportunity to move up there. So we have some migration happening, but there are some significant barriers in Long Island Sound. I want to thank all the people who did the work that's represented here, students, postdoc, fellow faculty member, and managers at the state parks, and funding from Sea Grant. Thank you for your time. I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks very much, Shimi. Now over to the tropics. We've got Dr. Naveen Namboothri up next. He's the director of the Dakshin Foundation, a biodiversity conservation and environmental policy organization based in Bangalore, India. We're going to hear about climate change impacts on fishery stocks and community-based management solutions in the Lakshadweep and Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal off the coast of India. Naveen, over to you.
Hi, so I'm Naveen Namboothri, work with Dakshin Foundation, and I'm here to talk about democratizing climate change, potentially looking at climate change from a fisheries perspective, and specifically in the Indian context, and looking at what are some of the major issues with regards to fisheries and climate change in India, and also look at some of, not just from the environment and ecosystem perspective, look at climate change from and climate change and potential opportunities of engaging fisher communities in developing, bottom-up ways of addressing issues of climate change, right? And just to give you some context about the fisheries and the sector in India, it's a major contributor to India's GDP. More than 16 million people depend on fisheries and the allied sectors, with more than 4.5 million depending directly on fisheries. And more than 50% of these people live below poverty line in India. And there's apparently a fishing village every 3 or 4 kilometers along the coastline. We have a coastline of about 7,000 odd kilometers, right? And the coastal areas are also one of the biggest, targets for development, right? There's a big port-based development interest in the nation right now. So the coastal areas are also major hubs for development right now. But the people who live, particularly the fisher communities who live in this area, are not just a community. They're very socially, culturally, economically, and in many ways extremely diverse. The kind of fishing practices they follow, from people who just go out on foot into coastal systems and depend on resources for livelihoods, to people who depend on it in multiple ways. Communities together sometimes engage in operations as well. And there are the other end of the spectrum, which is this large-scale mechanized sector, which is also a big player and has a major influencer of the fishery sector in India. And and they are very, and a lot of the resources are currently, a lot of the coastal resources are being shared between these different, socio-culturally diverse group of, of fishers and fish practitioners of fishing, right? And after that, there is once the harvest part is over, there's another big role for or opportunity for people to earn livelihoods out of this is through the entire commodity chains and the trade links across this. It gives opportunities to engage multiple people and provides livelihoods for a large coastal community across India. But interestingly, there's a very little information on how climate change and fisheries interact. What's the effect of climate change on fisheries? There's very, very little information. And despite the contribution that fisheries does to the nation's economy and to its people, there's surprisingly very few studies. One of the few studies that I found was interesting is a study by Vivekanandan et al. That looks at the distribution of sardines, a very important, commercially important species in India, in relation to sea surface temperatures, and the very clear indications that the range sizes have increased with relation to temperature in areas where sardines were very rarely found, particularly along the east coast of India, where there wasn't a big sardine fisheries, as you can see, all the way up to south to central Southeast Indian coastline. Sardine fisheries has started increasing a lot, right? Now, what does this mean in terms of, in terms of, and there are many other such examples as well. There's evidence of species like mackerels having moved further down and being encountered more in trawl fisheries rather than in pelagic gill nets. There is evidence of threat-free breams whose, their spawning periods have changed. The fecundity rates and other phenological changes are quite apparent in some species. But what's also interesting is that aside from the obvious expansion and range, a lot of these observations were initially made by fishers, and then later scientists explored them a little bit more. And what's also interesting is that there's already adaptations happening. A lot of the Southeast Indian and also the entire East Coast now is seeing a thriving sardine fishery. People have changed their fishing practices. The markets have reoriented themselves to address this change in species distributions. But interestingly, none of these people are part of any conversations or dialogue on effect of climate change on fisheries. But there's barely any space to involve a platform to involve communities, despite making day-to-day observations, both biological, with the abiotic factors, with what's the conditions out there at sea. They have a good understanding of what's happening with the fish, with the weather patterns, all of this, right? But still there's barely any conversations or opportunities to engage these communities. And I think it's also probably linked to a systematic, incompatibility that local ecological knowledge doesn't speak the language of science, which is in a very codified data heavy kind of a manner. But we did try out as an experiment in Lakshadweep Islands, which is a group of atolls that is found along the west coast of India, that is also home to the Golden Line tuna fisheries, which is probably one of the most sustainable fishing practice in India. What we did there with the fisher communities is to try and address some of the management issues with the fisheries through very simple data collection efforts. There were big gaps in data specifically with certain aspects of the fisheries like bait resources and all of that. So we initiated a monitoring program involving fisheries, which operated on 4 islands for 4 years. And we have more than 4,000 data records and some very interesting patterns that comes out, right? There are island-wise differences. I'm just taking out a very few examples to kind of demonstrate that this simple community involved led monitoring program actually led to some interesting, information on what's happening with the catch. This is with the bait that they use to catch tuna, what's happening with their resources. This is one of the major limiting resource for their fishery. Similarly, with FADs, they wanted to know what's happening with is FADs good or bad. And what you can see is that specifically for yellowfin, FADs were not great. You were catching tunas that were much smaller sized, right? And so a lot of interesting things came out of it, but what it also led to is not just a monitoring initiative, but quickly it helped us engage with communities on multiple conversations, specifically with management of fisheries as well, right? And it led to interesting decisions that the communities made in terms of banning many, harmful practices that they were undertaking. They collectively got together and decided to, do away with many of those practices. But now that's just a quick glimpse as to what one can do with communities who are, who are dependent on resources, right? They really have day-to-day engagement there. You really do not need to expend a lot of resources and finances and all of that into collecting data or technological kind of information. Resources to kind of collect data on what's happening with climate change, but instead engaging communities provides a huge opportunity to kind of also democratize the process of the conversations around climate change. Why keep them as the people that we are completely blind to, but rather bring them on board, make them also the champions of of climate change. They're the ones who feel it. They're the ones who have actual stakes involved. So how do we also, there are lots of challenges in this. I'm not giving solutions here, but some of these things are really critical opportunities that we will miss out soon, because there's a lot of transitions happening in communities as well, right? So before things change drastically, we should try and leverage the inherent knowledge that's and information and the wisdom that's there in these communities, but also to try and mobilize them to help strengthen our hands in addressing climate change at a political level as well, right? This work is thanks to multiple people from Dakshim Foundation, specifically the Sustainable Fisheries team at Dakshim, and there's some future readings if you are interested in knowing more. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Naveen. Reminder, send questions if you have them about the panelists' presentations that you're seeing, generally about marine and climate impacts, please, the more the merrier. So now we're going to move on to Antarctica. Anne Christensen is up next, a fellow colleague of mine. She's a principal associate at the Pew Charitable Trust, serving on the Protecting Antarctica's Southern Oceans team. Anne is completing her PhD at the moment at the University of Minnesota on social and ecological implications of ecosystem-based approaches to climate change adaptation. Anne's going to speak about the climate impacts and governance tools currently in play in the Southern Ocean. Anne, over to you.
Thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to speak today. My name is Anne Christensen. I work for the Pew Charitable Trust Protecting Antarctica's Southern Ocean team, and I'm also in the final months of my PhD researching ecosystem-based approaches to climate change. Antarctica is otherworldly. Few get to travel there, and even fewer are afforded the opportunity to do research there. I was lucky enough to be one of the former, spending about a month in Antarctica in 2016 with 75 other female scientists. And I think the moment I fell in love with Antarctica was on Deception Island, when a chinstrap penguin decided that I was a suitable companion to hang out with on the beach. The Antarctic is unique not only for its wildlife and landscapes, being the coldest, driest place on Earth leads to some amazing adaptations, but for its unique governance structure and the conservation challenges that it faces. So starting with climate change in the Southern Ocean. Like the Arctic, climate change is disproportionately affecting the Antarctic, resulting in numerous physical and biological impacts. But we need to put this region into perspective. Antarctica is roughly the size of the continental United States and Mexico combined. So just like New England is not facing the same climate hazards as California, climate change is manifesting differently across the continent. And the Southern Ocean sees regional variations as well. Across seasons, sea ice concentrations vary drastically, while the strong Antarctic circumpolar current, as well as localized eddies and gyres, create unique regional conditions that result in non-uniform climate hazards. Thus, not all species are responding in the same way to climate change. Take penguins. Gentoo ranges are expanding, whereas Adelies, which are well known as the badasses of the penguin world, are contracting in range and facing catastrophic chick breeding failures. In 2017, an East Antarctic colony of 40,000 breeding pairs of Adelie penguins saw the survival of just 2 of its chicks. Emperor penguins are also faring poorly, with some researchers saying the iconic species will face extinction by the end of this century. Although penguins easily grab the world's attention, the diversity of marine predators, along with a multitude of fascinating and poorly understood benthic species, underscore the importance of taking precautionary management measures that increase ecosystem resilience. Of particular importance for management decisions are krill, the tiny crustacean that forms the base of the food web. There are an estimated 550 billion metric tons of krill in the Southern Ocean. Krill population ranges are moving southward, however, and contracting as suitable habitat butts up against the continent. Krill also depend on sea ice for breeding and foraging, so shifting ice patterns alters their population composition, spatial distribution, and abundance. Significant changes to the Antarctic krill population will have cascading impacts throughout the ecosystem, as numerous predators rely on krill as their primary food source. So who is concerned about these climate risks in the Southern Ocean, and who is involved in the discussions? The Antarctic region has a fascinating history of discovery, exploration, exploitation, conflict, and research. However, for our purposes, we will skip ahead to the height of the Cold War. In 1959, nations came together to sign the Antarctic Treaty, preserving the landmass as a place for peace and science. Later, in response to unsustainable krill fishing in the Southern Ocean, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources was created in 1982. CAMLAR meets yearly in Hobart, Australia, to discuss conservation measures, fisheries, and compliance, which together make up the regulatory framework for the Southern Ocean. This year is the first time that CAMLAR is meeting remotely, coincidentally finishing up the first week of the meeting today, which means that I have been up since 4 a.m. listening to deliberations. On the docket for next week's meeting are several tools that CAMLAR can reach agreement on, which would address climate change in the Southern Ocean. First and briefly, there are processes within CAMLAR to identify and protect vulnerable marine ecosystems like seamounts, hydrothermal vents, cold water corals, and sponge fields that are home to fragile and rare benthic species. On a much larger scale, marine protected areas are a tool that CAMLAR has already used to conserve marine ecosystems. In 2002, CAMLAR became the first international body to commit to creating a network of marine protected areas. So far, 2 MPAs have been designated, which combined cover 2.2 million square kilometers. Additionally, CAMLAR member nations have proposed 3 other multi-use MPAs, which would protect another 4 million square kilometers of ocean. MPAs are a nature-based solution to climate change in that they remove additional human pressures on ecosystems, in this case, industrial fishing. They conserve relatively intact ecosystems, which generally are more resilient to climate change than disturbed ecosystems, and they act as climate refugia. Networks of MPAs also help species adapt to climate change by creating pathways for migration and range shifts. However, because CAMLAR operates based on consensus, any member can block these MPAs, and currently China and Russia oppose their designation. In addition to MPAs, ensuring sustainable fishing is a key component of broader ecosystem climate resilience. In the Southern Ocean, there are 2 main fisheries, krill, which I spoke about before, and toothfish, which you may know as Chilean sea bass. Krill comprise the majority of the fisheries catch, with over 312,000 tons landed in 2018. This catch is increasingly concentrated in ecologically important areas in the Western Antarctic Peninsula. CAMLAR is currently at a pivotal moment for achieving an ecosystem-based management system for the krill fishery. The next step is to fully implement a work plan when current management measures expire next year. The survey and stock assessment components of this work plan haven't been updated for over 20 years, despite the rapid environmental change in this region. Additionally, the risk assessment will make for a truly ecosystem-based management system by spreading catches out to minimize impacts on predators. However, the implementation and ultimate efficacy of these solutions is dependent on successful governance and robust multilateral frameworks. Although decision-making is concentrated within CAMLAR, other institutions and stakeholders ultimately influence ecosystem vulnerability and adaptive capacity in the Southern Ocean. The Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, or ATCM, oversees decision-making on the continent, which of course influences marine ecosystems as well. And emission regulations put in place by nations and influenced by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change determine the extent of climate hazards in the Southern Ocean. In terms of CAMLAR regional governance, Robust research, monitoring, evaluation, and enforcement are key to ensure that any management action, whether that be the spatial or fisheries management I spoke of, is durable and effective. This is easier said than done, however, especially when it comes to climate change. Although CAMLR's mandate is conservation focused, increasingly fishing interests are siloed from conservation and often drive the decision making. Greater integration of climate change into management decision making is sorely needed. This is especially apparent at this year's CAMLR meeting, where most of the time is dedicated to discussing and agreeing upon fisheries issues and administration duties, whereas less than 1 hour in total is being set aside to discuss marine protected areas and climate change. Lastly, research is increasingly showing us that no matter the decision-making body, whether it be as simple as your household or your team at work, or as influential as a corporate boardroom or a multilateral conference of parties, supporting participatory processes and greater inclusion delivers more effective results. Although CAMLR membership has grown since 1982 and includes countries from every continent, except, of course, Antarctica itself, there are barriers within the governance system that limit full inclusion. The Commission conducts its business in only 4 languages, English, French, Russian, and Spanish, which limits full participation by all members. Data and proceedings are not public, which limits oversight and undermines transparency in multilateral decision-making broadly. Observers do not enjoy full participation and do not play a role in decision-making. The cost of research and fishing in the Southern Ocean and participation in CAMLR is prohibitively high for some nations. And lastly, the barriers to gender and non-white inclusion in STEM and decision-making remain and are starkly seen at CAMLR as well as other multilateral forums. These barriers to action and inclusion aren't only seen within CAMLR, but across climate decision-making. From the top at UNFCCC, where unequal representation of women, indigenous groups, and small or developing nations is very well documented, to the individual level, where disproportionate human vulnerabilities resulting from pre-existing structural inequalities are being magnified by climate change. Taken together, conservation and management decisions that protect ecosystems, greater integration of issues within decision-making bodies, and greater inclusion in this decision-making will help build resilience in the Southern Ocean. However, although regional governments is a critical response, it does not remove the climate impacts themselves. Ultimately, the actions I described here today, coupled with an immediate and significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions globally, is what the Southern Ocean needs to ensure survival of its fragile marine ecosystems. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to answering any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, panelists, for those wonderful presentations. We've got about 20 minutes left to hold a Q&A. Please, again, if you have any questions, seen some rolling in, please do send those. In the meantime, I'm going to kick us off with a question for each of the panelists in the order of their presentation. The question is, what do you envision as the biggest priority in terms of next steps for addressing climate change and the ecosystem you're focused on? So biggest priority in terms of next steps. Austin, let's go ahead and start with you.
A great question. You know, in the North, folks living in small communities were right at the front lines of climate change. And so there's a great opportunity for collaboration when it comes to understanding the very tippy top of trophic level changes, iconic marine mammal species, iconic marine wildlife, iconic Arctic wildlife, lots of opportunities for collaboration there. But we have to remember that there's also lower trophic level changes that are occurring very rapidly, the microbial environment. As the permafrost thaws, you know, who knows what is occurring and who knows how that is impacting trophic level changes, upper trophic level changes, as well as, you know, lower level trophic level changes. So I would sincerely hope that we are able to, you know, get past you know, political differences and really get to you know, sound climate change solutions that help us deal with these really severe changes that we're seeing.
Thanks, Austin. Shimmy, same question. Biggest priority in terms of next steps for your ecosystem type Long Island Sound area?
Well, the most important thing is the rate of sea level rise, but I'm going to say that, you know, that's not something that that's something much bigger than I can talk about here. I mean, that has to do with, greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So in terms of thinking of what we can do locally, I think I'm struck by how fortunate we are in Connecticut not to have to deal with the complicated multilateral framework that Anne was talking about. A lot of this is in the hands of the state. We doesn't need a lot of federal government involvement either. So in that sense, it's a much simpler problem. At the same time, I'm also struck that, the kind of engaging of communities that Naveen was talking about, and Austin too, isn't really happening so much in Connecticut. So, that's all in the framework of, if to protect tidal salt marshes in Connecticut, we need room for them to move upslope. It's pretty simple. So we need to protect that land. And some of that land is in state parks, where this is where I work because it's the easiest. But a lot of that land is people's backyards. And so thinking about how to engage people who are not resource dependent in the sense that Naveen and Austin are talking about, but do have a stake in the coast, how to engage those people and how they manage their land to allow salt marsh migration. That's I think pretty important.
Thanks, Shimmy. Naveen, over to you. Biggest priority.
Yeah, I'll second Austin on the points that he made. And like I said in my talk as well, I think there's a what we call the global south, the developing countries. I think there's a lot of, these are the next places in terms of, greenhouse gas emissions and all of that. So and we're talking about large populations of countries as well. And these are places where you really need to start building in a large conversations about, climate change need to be like quite big in these countries. It's right now, like I've said in the past as well, is that, it's very, it continues to be very urban kind of conversations in countries like India, where only people who have a certain level of privilege do engage in these conversations. It's not really a conversation that people who are there out in the forefronts do engage in. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And if we can leverage that kind of, that level of population who really have stakes involved, I think that will make a big political change. Yeah.
Thanks, Naveen. Yeah, important point about that engagement with community level. Anne, over to you on biggest priorities in your ecosystem.
Well, CAMLR is already set up to designate the 3 marine protected area proposals that I discussed in my presentation. These are based on the best available science. Hundreds of scientific data layers went into them. They took years to design. They have the buy-in from the majority of the CAMLR member nations. And so getting those over the line really will help create that resilient system that I talked about, but also then will act as climate reference areas. So we can better understand the impacts of climate change, removing fisheries pressures. And that way we can better inform the ecosystem-based fisheries management that I spoke of as well. So those are teed up and ready to go, and they can happen next week if everyone agrees to them. So that's really the highest priority.
Nice, and very timely. Okay, so a question. Thank you guys for sending these into the chat box. We've got a few rolling in. Austin, gonna kick this one over to you. How can marine scientists better support the work of Indigenous folks and amplify the work of Indigenous advocates like yourself?
Well, if you want to get involved in groundbreaking Arctic science and understand what's happening in the Arctic, really consider investing time, resources, and yourself, who you are, into the Arctic. There are great examples of how science and traditional knowledge work together. Great examples of really good science that answers questions in realistic formats, that talks about impacts in realistic ways. Like I said, folks in the Arctic are eyes and ears for groundbreaking, first response level sort of changes that are being seen. And when a good collaboration, a real collaboration, not just spending a day or two in the Arctic, or even just a month in the Arctic, or spending time on a ship viewing communities through binoculars, really investing yourself in communities, in Arctic communities, would really go a long way towards collaboration, understanding, as well as developing really good science.
Thanks, Austin. Naveen, question for you here around Dakshin Foundation. Have you identified a specific co-management regime that meets or comes near to the targets that you all are using for stakeholder inclusion?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yes, we started off with a monitoring program which involved communities collecting very simple information about what they do and engage with, especially with regards to their fisheries on a regular basis. But that gave us an opportunity. Our longer term interest was to create a co-management regime, and it's been a really challenging thing to do in a country as diverse as India, which is, especially on the mainland coast of India, it's really challenging. So which is why Lakshadweep, being an island system, was much more easier to deal with, smaller administrative unit as well. But we did, like I shared in the last slide, towards the end of it, we actually, just through collecting information, it opened up so many opportunities to have conversations with fisher communities about trends in fisheries. Why are certain stocks of tuna, varying? Is it good to, fish near FADs or not? Is more number of FADs good or bad? So that kind of led to a lot of interesting conversations, and it's actually the communities who've come up with all the bans that I mentioned in the system. But getting to a co-management system in the true sense, where the state and the communities are at an equal level of power, that is not an easy negotiation to make. It takes a lot of effort for the state to be confident that yes, communities can also involve in, say, collecting information that's reliable, that the science or the knowledge that they have is something that is compatible with contemporary science. So there's a little bit of friction there, but because it's Lakshadweep, the state government, people who work with these agencies are also local. So it helps in a big way. So we're hoping to use that example or that model and, try and scale it up to other sites. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Naveen. Now, Anne, you spoke of the need for interdisciplinary, diverse, gender-inclusive approaches to address climate change impacts. I'm wondering, can you expand upon why these perspectives are so important in a region where it's not populated by humans?
Yeah, so I think we give ourselves an easy out if we say Antarctica doesn't have an indigenous community there, doesn't have a permanent community there. There are thousands of people that seasonally live and work in Antarctica, and thousands more that are part of the research community and the governance community. And historically, women especially have been completely excluded from this. I know women personally who have applied to do Antarctic research, and we're told that they can't because there are no facilities there for women. And so this is a very current subject, and it's just recently that we're starting to see more female inclusion in this region as well. And then, of course, we need to have the inclusive perspectives for any climate solution. So I talked a little bit about social vulnerabilities to climate change, and so we can look at this kind of idea of victimhood of who is most vulnerable, but without having them as part of the solution as well, we have an incomplete approach to climate change. And so it's the same with the Antarctic. We need to have inclusive voices from all around the world who are talking about climate solutions there, so we can get all perspectives and have a more comprehensive solution to the issue.
Thanks, Anne. Austin, I'm going to bring a question back over to you. I think oftentimes climate change is spoke about in terms of future impacts, but for many, the realities are happening today. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the sort of the changes you're seeing around your home in Nome.
Well, yeah, this past summer, we've been experiencing a large-scale foreign marine debris event. And lately we've kind of become fixated on that, with statewide news or national news. But that's just one of the things. I guess if I were to point to, one thing that really impacts a lot of us, including myself as a user of these resources, since at least 2011, ice-associated marine mammals ring seal, spotted seal, ribbon seal, bearded seal have been experiencing these really unusual mortality events declared by NOAA as UME events. And we haven't been able to understand why that's occurring. But when we, as hunters, experience these things occurring, we really have questions about ourselves and policy as to how that impacts our food security, because marine mammals are utilized in our region quite extensively for food, primarily for food. There's really no substitute for the foods that we eat, and if you were to consider substituting them, it'd be very expensive. But these unusual mortality events are probably a big part of the reason as to why we've seen large-scale population declines in ice-associated seals, which, at least in our legendary history, which could go back some 10,000 years, is unprecedented. And these changes are something that we should all take note of, not just for us, but for the impact that they might have globally.
Thanks, Austin. Shimi, question for you's come in. Could you speak to the role that salt marshes play in coastal ecosystems, particularly in response to sea level rise? And a follow-up around maybe the role for salt marshes to act as a sort of ecosystem-based adaptation response.
Right. So yeah, so I mean, two of the functions that salt marshes play are carbon sequestration and kind of coastal protection. So having that ring of salt marshes on the coast does protect upland coastal communities from the full impacts of storms and waves and sea level rise. So keeping those intact is a form of climate adaptation. And also the blue carbon, which is being talked about in another panel, of those the carbon sequestration of those salt marshes is a form of climate change mitigation. So in addition to kind of the habitat and recreation values of salt marshes, they're also directly linked to how the people and ecosystems on the coast are going to experience climate change. So anything we can do to either protect those marshes from non-climate threats or help them migrate and adapt to sea level rise, I think would in the end benefit salt marshes, but also other ecosystems and human communities.
Thanks, Shimi. Naveen, question about, does Dakshin Foundation engage with international donors and funding institutions that evaluate conservation success based on area-based marine protection? How can co-management practices be incorporated into these international metrics for marine conservation success?
Yes, thanks. Very good question. So we do have a lot of compatibility issues trying to implement what I would say very Western-based approaches of conservation, which is based on having protected areas in wildlife spaces. And in a country like India, for instance, where, like I said, there is a fishing village every 3 or 4 kilometers, and people have been going out and relying on those, on fisheries for a fairly long time. So, suddenly having areas set aside as protected areas often leads to significant conflict. So it doesn't serve the purpose of conservation, neither does it, serve the purpose of livelihood. So it's not like the most compatible solutions. And quite often these have been, increasingly co-management approaches where you have strong community involvement is being promoted as solutions, and not just in India, in many Southeast Asian countries and other places as well. This is quite South American countries as well. It's quite the new way to go about it. But I think even within the international donor communities as well, there is increasing recognition of these complications. And I think we need to have very regional approaches to what works and what doesn't. I mean, at the end of the day, you need your money to, get better. If you need better results for the marine systems, you need to be flexible, and you can't expect one model to come, kind of address all concerns everywhere. So I think there's an increasing realization among the donor communities, and there are shifts happening, but it's slow.
Thanks, Naveen. And I'm going to wrap this up with a question to each of the panelists. We've got 5 minutes left, and unfortunately, I don't have a mute button. So if you could you give us one nugget of success or glimmer of hope that is carrying you forward in the work that you do, and share that with the audience? Austin, let's start with you.
Well, one glimmer of hope, of course, is my involvement with environmental organizations, work with my tribes. Simply knowing that folks are concerned, folks want to help, and help us mitigate changes to the Arctic. I've experienced in this last decade, lots of international collaboration all across the globe. And so I'm very thankful for those that do care, those that do want to collaborate, those that want to address climate change.
Thanks, Austin. Shimmy, your glimmer of hope, nugget of success?
Can I give two quick ones? One is nature, which is just watching these marsh plants and marsh processes move upslope on their own, and just the ability of that system to adapt is really remarkable. And just seeing that nexus of the forest and the ocean, kind of coming together is pretty amazing. The human side of that is just again, I've worked mostly in state parks because it's much easier, but the park staff, park managers have been so great about being really thoughtful about what needs to happen in that process of taking a landscape that is very much human used and allowing ecosystem values to return to it, or to come into it without totally disrupting that human use, making that balance. So it's been inspiring.
Thanks, Shimmy. Naveen, your take.
Yes, I kind of go with the point that Shimon made as well. The other side of me is I'm a reef ecologist and work quite a lot in places like the Andamans and Lakshadweep, and seen a lot of these reef systems getting battered by different climate change events. But somehow I feel very optimistic with marine systems. The ability to bounce back is actually quite promising and incredible in some of these sites. And on the other side, with the fisher communities, I've seen some good examples where communities can get together and make a difference. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of hope if we put our minds to it. Yeah.
That's great. Anne?
I think probably seeing how the youth of the world right now are being more and more engaged in climate change is really heartening for me. And then in terms of the Southern Ocean, there is just phenomenal international collaborations for research going on. I want to see more of those, and scientists are coming up with really creative ways to do research in the Southern Ocean. It has to do with satellites and different sorts of drone-based research, when before it was just you have a transect of a ship and you're counting seals, but now we can do really amazing things and are discovering more penguin colonies all the time and learning more about the species there. So I'm really hopeful that the science can be implemented in the management decisions.
Awesome. Good to hear all of you speak on the power of people and nature. I want to thank the panelists for being here today, and all of you attendees for following along. It was a wonderful discussion. Coming up next is the Societal Adaptation Planning and Resilience panel in this same meeting room, beginning at 1:20 p.m. Eastern. So there's about a 10-minute break there. And if you're looking for the Marine Natural Carbon Solutions panel, that will also begin at 1:20 at a link that was shared in the chat box, or you can go to the conference homepage. Join me thanking everybody. Go ahead and send any questions you might have. We'll be sure to follow up if and as necessary. Otherwise, thank you and stay safe.